Generation, the autobiography by Mary Tamm. Read by the Time Keys Romana Leah Elizabeth Rose Dougal. Chapter 15, 1978, Doctor Who. My name is Romana de Vortolunda, line from the Rebos Operation, Episode 1 of The Key to Time. My agent, Irene Dawkins, had a jolly chum by the name of George Spenton Foster, whom I had met on a number of occasions. He was an aging film and TV director, and was, to boot, a very warm, witty, and clever man. I adored him. On my return from the Canaries, I had a call from Irene to inform me that George was to direct the 4-part story that would begin the next series of Doctor Who, and was casting the part of the new companion, Romana. Would I be interested? My first thought was to say no. I was not a great sci-fi fan, and had not watched Who for years. More pertinently, I only had a vague idea as to the role of the assistant which, as I recalled, was a subsidiary one to the doctor's, and involved a lot of frightened screaming and question-asking. I decided it was not for me, having played much juicier parts hitherto, thereby deeming the part of companion beneath me. I had, of course, seen the inception of the series, with William Hartnell playing the lead role way back in 1963, and remember vividly the excited discussion at school on Monday morning about this new and innovative TV show. It was like nothing anybody had ever seen before. Every Saturday from then on, I would gather with friends at our respective homes, alternating houses from week to week, and settle down at tea time to view the latest episode from whichever sofa we were on. Irene was disappointed at my reaction, which was lukewarm to say the least, and rang off. A couple of days later she called again, to suggest that I should reconsider in the light of new information. Not only was the new assistant on a par with the doctor in terms of intelligence, but she was a time lady, which was a first, and a completely different kettle of fish from her run-of-the-mill antecedents. Also, it was mooted that she would not be a mere appendage, but a sidekick, a new concept for females on TV. This was before the times of strong women's screen roles. The feminist movement was in its infancy, and the major decision-makers in the visual media were almost exclusively male. The late and great Verity Lambert, the first producer of Doctor Who, had of course a huge input into the show, but she was the exception that proved the rule. I told Irene that this time I would mull it over, and picked up the phone again to speak to my old radar pal Louise Jameson about it. She was the present assistant, and had of course had enormous success with her portrayal of Leela, the savage warrior woman. I had reservations for this too. Would anyone be willing to follow such a popular act? Louise and I chatted for some time about my dilemma, and although she told me her time on Who had not been all sweetness and light, she exhorted me to go for the part. I called Irene a couple of days later, having talked it over with Marcus and a few other actor chums, who all thought it a positive career move, and told her to go ahead and arrange a casting. I admired the present Doctor, Tom Baker, as an actor, having seen him playing Rasputin in Nicholas and Alexandra. My mom had thought him very good in the part too, knowing, as she inevitably did, a great deal about the Russian history that the film portrayed. So her seal of approval echoed mine wholeheartedly, and then I suddenly remembered that, of course, I had also seen Tom in another movie, The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, which I had done a screen test for, so thought it a happy coincidence. Maybe we were destined to work together. My final consideration in going for the part was financial. Marcus was still a law student, and we could not survive on his meager grant, so the opportunity for regular income, and the possibility of moving out of my bachelor girl flat to somewhere we could make a fresh start as man and wife, was tempting. Unbeknownst to me, and prior to my tootling along to the Beeb for my meeting, Graham Williams, the producer, and George had already seen about 600 girls for the part of Romana, and had whittled down the numbers to just 6, who are now to be screen-tested. I went along, therefore, quite late in the day, and, as is always the case with parts that one is not absolutely mad about getting, with a totally laid-back attitude, and also with a touch of, I'm too good for this thrown in. The arrogance of youth, I positively cringe to think of it now. I swanned in, not aware that the impression I created was exactly what they were looking for in the character, who was a bit up herself, and was told later that Graham and George decided on me in about 2 minutes flat. However, the screen test had been arranged and were to be the next day. It was, after all, extremely important to see how the chemistry of all the actresses up for the part worked with Tom's. Most unusually, he was to act alongside us for all the tests. Most leading men would not consider allowing themselves to this task. Of course, once I began to play the role, I was actually extremely nervous to be part of this historic show, and any doubts I might have had about my status in regard to it were dissipated. However, I did try and recapture a vestige of the arrogance I had casually and somewhat ignorantly assumed before, encouraged largely by Graham, who told me it was just what the part called for. George rang me up the night before the screen test. He was really rooting for me to get the part, and told me to try and do something really bold to mark me out from the other girls. His suggestion was that, as I was saying a particular line, I should casually saunter over to Tom, wind my arms around his neck, and sit on his knee. After we said our goodbyes, I put the phone down and considered his idea. I looked at the script I had been given for the next day, and could not see how the lines tallied in any way with the actions George had mooted. Could I make it work? And more importantly, would I have the nerve to carry it off? I decided to sleep on it. I arrived at the BBC the next day and met Tom, who was in a good humour, genial, gallant, and jolly. So far, so good. We started the scene, and when we got to the part where George had suggested the cheeky moves, I simply carried on without approaching my leading man in any way, feeling simply too nervy to make any improvised changes. When I told Tom about it, weeks later, he roared with laughter and told me I should have gone for it. Poor George was not amused, however, and asked me afterwards why I had not opted for his idea. Luckily, I did not have to answer, as Graham Williams, the producer, came up to thank me for my contribution, telling me in time-honored tradition that he would let me know. I travelled home in my little Minnie. I had a red one at the time, and reflected on the fact that I had probably blown it, as my director did not seem too happy with my performance. Oh, well, I thought to myself, I did not really want the part anyway, but I was lying to myself, as deep down I knew only too well that by now I wanted the part very much indeed. I had to sleep this night, mentally going over and over the scene I had done with Tom, and realizing all the mistakes I had made. I felt sure than ever that the audition had been a write-off. I was wrong, however, as the next day Irene rang to tell me that I was the unanimous choice for Ramona. My new life as an extraterrestrial was about to begin, and the irony of the situation did not escape me. My status as an outsider had paid off yet again. I had done well in my career so far playing foreigners, and Ramona was more foreign than most, being an inhabitant of the distant planet Gallifrey. Marcus and I celebrated with a bottle of Silver Jubilee champagne. My father-in-law had purchased several crates for our wedding, and there was an ample supply left over. It did not last long, however, as the following week the press descended on my little flat and helped me drink the lot. There must have been 20 journalists and photographers crammed into my tiny sitting-room dining room. Graham Williams was there too, desperately trying to control them all, and did an admirable job under the circumstances, as they all milled around, snapping and quacking like so many ducks. I felt a mad impulse to give way to a bout of hysterical laughter, and to deflect this decided to offer the champagne round. I was photographed with a glass in my hand, looking inanely happy, an image which appeared in every national and local newspaper the following day. When they had all trooped off, Graham and I had a quiet cup of tea and chatted about the months of grueling work ahead. The fun part was over, and now the hard graft was to commence. I sobered up quickly, in more ways than one, after Graham had left, took off the flowing black and white Sir Lincoln button kaftans I had donned for the press junket, and proceeded to wash up the empty glasses. Graham became a very good friend to me over the coming weeks, and was a steady rock in the turmoil that inevitably occurs on a long-running drama. I was really lucky to have him around as a constant from story to story and episode to episode. The Key to Time, as the new series was known, was to be presented under an umbrella theme. That is, each group of 4 or 6 episodes formed one story that could be viewed independently, but all 26 episodes of the overall series opened up into a larger picture, namely the search for the 6 segments of the Key to Time. But before rehearsals began, I was to be fitted for my first costume, a fabulous, floor-length, white creation which June Hudson, the costume designer, showed me the sketches for. We sallied forth one morning to the Muse studio where Cilla Black's dressmaker worked, and she measured me up. I was very impressed by the craftsmanship and excellence of the gown. I had seen Scylla's stage and TV dresses when she had been a solo singer, and could only imagine what they must cost. I had not one but 5 frocks made up in the same design in case of accidents. As it happened, they all later vanished without a trace after filming was over. I know not what became of them to this day, and no, I do not have one lurking at the back of my wardrobe. If only. As well as the dress, I had a gigantic ostrich feather-trimmed cloak to go over the top, in more ways than one. It tickled terribly, and the feathers floated everywhere, much to Tom's annoyance. He could become quite irascible on set, although a sweetie off. Subject, maybe. I surmised to nerves, just like the rest of us lesser thesps. The dress had its drawbacks, too, as I soon discovered. Because it was made of a heavy silk jersey, it stretched almost 2 inches every day, and the hem was constantly being cut off to stop my tripping over it. It was a huge hit with the viewers, and I have had masses of fan mail over the years commenting on it. It is always copied at Who conventions, too, where I have seen literally hundreds of versions. More of this later. I was very nervous on my first day in the studio, not least because of Tom's constant snipes about my costume, too white, apparently, or too feathery, as aforementioned, and I felt quite shaky for the first half hour. I had not expected this, but the pressure of rising to the occasion was quite terrifying, as is often the case when entering into a long-running series as a newcomer, and this was not just an any old series, but a British institution no less. My life had moved incredibly swiftly to this point from my student days. I not only had a whirlwind romance and marriage under my belt, but had amassed a huge body of work, and therefore experience in my chosen profession. This, and the fact that I had also achieved some fame, were factors that were instrumental in my standing where I was now. I later heard that the makers of the program had deliberately decided to go for a more high-profile actress in the part of the companion. For the first time ever, it is the norm nowadays for stars to appear in the program, but I like to think I paved the way. My life in Bradford seemed light years away, where my only worries were about school revision and piano practice. These factors never occurred to me at the time, obviously, but looking back, I can now relate to what the French would say, "Chez les jeunes ça va, chez le vieux pour voir," or "it's easy to be wise with hindsight." Back in the studio, I soon calmed down, and Tom also relaxed a little, although his language between takes turned the air below. I blew back, having been warned by Louise not to take any nonsense from him. He seemed surprised at the vocabulary I returned to match his, and gave me a thoughtful stare. Ha, I thought, he's testing my mettle. I hoped I would pass, and so we went on, curse for curse, like players in a tennis game, until we finally established a truce, returning to normal language, much to the relief of the studio crew. Deuce. From there we eventually went on to form a working relationship which we both enjoyed, and which, consequently, the viewers did too. It was a bit of a shaky start, though. Tom was a very talented actor, and for me, the definitive Doctor. He was in his 5th year of playing the role, and the strain was beginning to get to him. He was voluble in the extreme in his views on the script, and the directors he worked with. Luckily, George knew how to handle him, not letting him pause in rehearsal to tell his wealth of anecdotes, and pushing him on in the studio whenever breaks occurred. Some directors, alas, did not have George's skills, and were eaten for breakfast, as Tom certainly did not suffer fools gladly. I had never come across another actor like him, but his energy and enthusiasm, coupled with his personality and creativity, could not help but impress, and I became quite inspired in my scenes with him. Sometimes, as he invented a particular piece of business, or ad-libbed a line or two, he certainly kept me on my toes. He was never boring, anyway, which I thought to be a good thing, with so long a work schedule stretching ahead. Prior to our studio day, we had attended rehearsals at the Acton Hilton, which was like a home from home to me now. Always a comfort. The guest cast for the Revo's operation, the first story in the series, included Ian Cuthbertson, who had led those popular TV series of the 70s, Sutherland's Law and Budgie, the latter with Adam Faith. He was a fine performer and suited the part of Garin very well, as it required a combination of skilled acting and humour. Other talents included Nigel Plaskett, Cyril Luckham, and Paul Seed, who later went on to become a very successful director. Timothy Bateson, who played Binro, had appeared in the original production of Samuel Beckett's masterpiece, Waiting for Godot, in 1955. I was very lucky overall during the course of filming The Key to Time to work with so many wonderful and illustrious actors. It became one of the perks of the job. After my initial experience, I always made a great effort to welcome new actors into the series, sensing their trepidation at being in the show, so akin to mine earlier. Rebos, written by Robert Holmes, was an inventive and absorbing story which I enjoyed very much. The script was heavy on dialogue rather than action and very much driven by the characters, all of whom were well drawn by Robert. It was full of wit and somewhat theatrical too, which suited George's directing style to a T. George was wonderfully helpful with the actors, and consequently hugely popular. He was a great director for me to start the series off with. There were no location scenes in the story, so all the filming took place in the studios, where amazing sets were dressed and redressed, evoking again a theatrical style which gave the story a historical atmosphere so essential to the plot. Of course, we also had the inevitable corridors and passages that were the hallmarks of Who. My heavy costume and the heat of the sets made for an uncomfortable working process at times, but the mark of the lighting, or rather lack of it, helped establish the reality of the scenes for me, especially when I was confronted by the Shrivensail, which had 2 men fitted inside a monster costume. To my myopic view, it looked very scary and lifelike in the dark corner it appeared from. Actually, I found all the monsters quite scary for the simple reason that I could not see any of them very clearly. Taking part in the sci-fi series presented unique challenges, especially when it comes to the strange names and technical words that were so often part of the script. My first stumbling block came when I had to announce my name, Ramona de Vartrelunda, which was a bit of a mouthful, to say the least. The original spelling had an N where the tr is, which may well have been a typing mistake in the first draft of the script, so I was even more confused when I saw the second draft and had 2 new consonants to grapple with. Was I glad when I saw to be shortened to Romana, or Trattoria Romana, as Lalla Ward wittily quipped when I met her at the read-through for the last story. The character was almost quite as good as promised, although I did still have a scream or 2 written into the role. There was a huge opportunity missed by the writers, and possibly by myself also, to make her more weird. She was from another planet, yet spoke and behaved in a very terrestrial way. Could there have been more strangeness incorporated into the scripts? A quirky catchphrase? Or odd physical movement, say? Again, it is probably too easy to be wise with hindsight in this respect. I did enjoy playing her, nevertheless, especially as the series progressed, and was always very happy to be in the TARDIS, my favourite set, though not so happy to be enclosed within the confines of the police box prop used in exterior scenes, which was cramped in the extreme, what with a large man and a tin dog squashed in beside me. More of that later. Clive James asked me years later to appear on his chat show. I was terribly excited, until I learned he only wanted me to scream. I declined. Surely the labour of my craft should not be distilled to a mere squawk. Yet again, I realized that the perception of the Doctor Who girl remains stereotyped in the consciousness of the nation as a mere damsel in distress. To paraphrase a P.G. Wodehouse line from his play Good Morning Bill, which I toured in many years later, I may be a damsel, but I am not mere. Wish I had said that to Clive.